Many thanks, Mark, for your kind words, and to Ifri for inviting me. I only hope you won't regret it, but it's too late. Doors are closed and you can't run away. Um, I was quite interested when I was asked to speak about strategic autonomy and the European strategic autonomy, because I claim some ownership on this concept being introduced in the European Union. Marc made the history of how it came up in the French collective thinking. In the EU, it was a totally unknown concept until 2013. By the end of 2013, when the European External Action Service, of which I was part at the time, drafted a paper for the European Council, the gathering of the European leaders, that was supposedly going to discuss defense. As usual with the European Council sessions, they didn't have much time to discuss defense. Many other events were by then taking the floor, as you can imagine. 2013, the turmoil in Syria, the beginning of what was then called the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. So I think honestly, they spent something like 15 minutes on this famous paper. Just put it aside, took note of it, and that was it for the strategic autonomy concept. It went out very quickly. Um, so I may be here for the wrong reasons, but I will stay and try to make you understand how strategic autonomy was revived, got a new lease of life, and became, as Marc has just said, the center, the core of the discussions today in Europe. But where I would like to stress here today in my few words to you is the fact that strategic autonomy has morphed in a totally different way from what it was in 2013 and later on when it came back, and has become today something like the core of the existential challenge that Europe is facing today. Moving from what was by then a concept mostly dedicated and hooked on defense and security in the military sense of it, and let's put it that way, in the geopolitical sense, to become a concept now that is much more linked to geoeconomics, and that we are facing now with the new, renewed, revisited concept of strategic autonomy, the perfect concept that that is at the crossroad of economy and politics. And I think that is quite important to understand, because it has brought also at the same time a complete change of mindset inside the European Union. And that will be the theme of what I would like to explain to you in very few words. How could I go on from 2013 to today? Very easily, just by reminding you the major milestones that have brought strategic autonomy where it is today. As I said, it was left aside in 2013. It came back in 2016 through the European Global Strategy, drafted at that time by the new High Representative, Federica Mogherini, who put the strategic autonomy concept right in the middle of this whole geopolitical strategy for Europe. It was mainly at that time, as I said earlier, focused on defense and security, and it was triggered, I would say, by three main events that had definitive impact on the European Union. Once Mrs. Mogherini launched this global strategy concept and document, what happened? You had, first of all, Brexit, which was UK leaving the European Union, And let's be honest, UK was not the most favorable support of a stronger European defense. And that, to some extent, changed the whole context of EU discussion inside the EU. Secondly, Trump, one, arrived at the White House, and with him came the start of what I would call a somewhat uneasy and unstable relations between the EU and the US with regard to NATO. You remember that famous first meeting at NATO headquarters with Donald Trump. You can still find the pictures on YouTube, and they are still fascinating today. But it was the beginning of it all. The push from the US administration under Trump 1 for more increased military expenditure on behalf of the EU, and so on and so forth. But the third factor, a very interesting one, was the election, more or less at the same time, of the new French president, Emmanuel Macron, and who in his famous Sorbonne speech in 2017, a few months after his election during the spring of that same year, came up once again with this idea of strategic autonomy for the European Union and made it a kind of personal crusade to implement it among the EU circle. If you remember well, this is the time when Angela Merkel, the then German Chancellor, said famously, this is the time when Europeans have to take their destiny in their own hands, 2018. But still, we were far away from what we wanted to do. And this is the long story of how strategic autonomy slowly moved in. Why did it take a long time to happen? And can I reminded you that 2018 is also the moment when President Trump decides to leave the famous agreement on the nuclear program with Iran, the GCPOA, as we call it among experts. Trump left the GCPOA at the time, and this was a perfect moment for Europeans to illustrate what they meant by strategic autonomy. And in fact, this is what they tried to do. They came up very strongly against President Trump's decision to withdraw from the GCPOA, and they said that they would go on their own with their two other partners, Russia and China, to implement the nuclear agreement with Iran. And in fact, the reality is that it petered out. The Trump administration threatened the Europeans and the European enterprise with secondary sanctions, as they themselves set up very strong economic sanctions against Iran. And in fact, Europe didn't have, I would say, the political will, neither some of the instruments they have today to stand up to secondary sanctions. But so be it for this effort to set up a stronger, enhanced strategic autonomy at that time. I would add that there were two other factors that played against, to some extent, the strategic autonomy. And let's be honest with this also. It was mostly a French concept, as I was saying. President Macron made it his personal flagship in his whole European policy. And as it was quite often, as it happens quite often with the French, it was highly conceptual and not really concrete. Many of our partners at the time asked the French government and its representative, what is it exactly that you mean by strategic autonomy? And the French never really managed to explain in very concrete terms what it was all about. Think about the nuclear French deterrence. Think about the whole issue of the relationship with the US and with some of our other third partners around the world. And therefore, for many of our partners, strategic autonomy sounded very much like an attempt by the French to take the lead in the in defense and security sector. And they were not ready for that. I'm not entirely sure they're ready for that still today, but that's another matter. So what happened since 2017, 2018 with the strategic autonomy, and what is the reason why it has suddenly found a new life and ignited a new momentum, a new impetus? I think there are two very obvious reasons, and we're living through them, of course. The first one is war that has come back to Europe, as we all know. February 2022, the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and suddenly the feeling among the Europeans that they really need to become more serious about security and defense. And there you have seen unfolding from the Commission many propositions that are either on the table or already adopted about common purchases of military equipment, common manufacturing of those same equipment, new head goals about the 5% of 5% of GDP in military expenditures, so on and so forth. I won't go into all the details, but the war in Ukraine has definitely given a new lease of life to the strategic autonomy in the military sector, no doubt about this. But the second difference, and the one we are witnessing now every day, the second difference compared to previous years, of course, is the sudden new war on tariff and the decision by the Trump government administration, let's put it that way, to go for the tariff escalation and playing, I would say, the brutal method of balance of power using strength and force to impose and implement his own ideas about tariff and trade policy in general. I would insist on that. And this is where we are today. And this is where, as I was saying before, strategic autonomy has come at the crossroad of economics and politics today, and what it has become so important in the whole conversation we're having at the moment in Brussels. It comes in the context, of course, of a completely different mindset among Europeans that is best illustrated by the two reports that came out last year in the EU. The Letta report on the state of play inside the internal market, and the Draghi report. Draghi report became very famous at the moment, which was about how can Europe regain its competitiveness in the present global economic world. The main conclusions there is that Europe has all the necessary instruments to become again and to regain its role as an important economic power if it wants to, and if it does the necessary reform it needs to do with the internal market, get rid of some of the limitations that are still there, and there are much more than we usually think. We tend to believe in Europe, after the Delors Commission went out, that the internal market was done and that all barriers had been brought down, but in fact it's far from true. If you look at energy, for instance, telecommunication, transport, research, the Letta report has time and again underlined that we're still very far from it. Second idea is that money is there. Lots of savings, as we know, in Europe, which at the moment, because there is no union of the capital markets, the 27 capital markets, much of that European savings for the time being goes to other countries and mostly to the United States. The European Central Bank has impressive figures about more than 300 billion euros moving to the US, when in fact they could be highly useful here in Europe. And the third idea was overregulation, of course, that Europe for the time being has mostly replied to its current, I wouldn't say decline, but lack of competition with regard to its main competitors. Europe has mostly replied by new regulations without really looking at how it could improve his new tech sector, how it could reply to the challenges it's facing in many sectors, artificial intelligence, quantum, microchips, so on and so forth. So suddenly Europe has taken has understood, I would say, the reality of where it is. And this has been a wake-up call. To some extent, the very difficult negotiation with the Trump II administration on trade, as we have seen this summer at Turnberry, the Turnberry Agreement, has created a huge outcry all over Europe, as we all know, and has suddenly made it plain for all to see that when we were talking about the risk of a European irreversible decline, it was really there. And I would put together so that you understand that strategic autonomy today is as much geopolitical as it is geoeconomical. It's the two pictures of the Alaska summit on one side with President Trump and President Putin dealing together about the future of Ukraine without the presence of any European leader, and the recent summit in South Korea between President Trump and President Xi Jinping, where also the Europeans were absent, when both were discussing about critical minerals and how to relaunch, to some extent, the world trade rather than confronting each other. Suddenly, for the Europeans, there was an awareness that wasn't there for the time being. And this is where I would insist. The mindset is changing at the moment in Europe. For anyone who has the unfortunate privilege of my own age and who have been discussing for so many years in Brussels the issue of reciprocity, of how to protect European economy and European industry, with the immediate opposition of many countries, I would say mostly from the northern part of Europe, to hear today, as I have heard very recently in Brussels or even here in Paris in conferences that are taking place regularly, to hear representatives from countries like Germany and the Netherlands, Sweden, etc., saying that now times have changed and we need to protect ourselves. Seeing the Dutch government taking over Nexperia, the microchip company in the Netherlands, which was largely owned by Chinese interest. To hear some of our colleagues telling us from Germany, telling us that what has happened in recent days, the decision by the Chinese government to apply to impose upon a European company the need to have a license for importing critical minerals for China, and also the need to get the authorization to afterwards export what they have manufactured, which is exactly the secondary sanctions of the US administration that been so much blame on the European side. All those features show that suddenly there is a recognition on the European side that something has to change. And this is why suddenly strategic autonomy has become so relevant and so timely. Where do we go from here? It seems to me that if you look at strategic autonomy, you have to deconstruct, I would say, the two words. Strategic is about strategy, of course. And this is what, contrary to what quite often European leaders and European representatives from the EU institution don't seem entirely to understand. It's that today we need to walk on our 2 feet. The need for contingency planning, crisis management mode to answer the kind of events we're facing every day, the decisions that we're facing from the big global powers or sometimes from some of our other partners around the world. The need to react quickly, the kind of quick delivery, short-term action, and the need at the same time to look at the long-term game. And this, the Europeans have not been always very good at foresight, planning, understanding where we're moving, get our acts together and understand the reality of the world as it stands today. So strategic means not only coming out with interesting communication on a future strategy for the Middle East or others, or even China, as we did in 2019, is going deeper, digging deeper in understanding what is the political will on the other side, what are the intentions, how to react to that, how to put our act together in responding to that. And on the other side, strategic autonomy is also about autonomy. And as you will hear more and more from many representatives from the French government, and I hope also as we move along from the EU institutions, autonomy is about sovereignty and independence, which means refusing to accept any kind of tutorship from external partners. The need to have our destiny in our own hands, as Chancellor Merkel was saying, and to keep it that way. It's secondly about security, but economic security also, political and geopolitical security also, which means not only having the defense capacities we're slowly building up, but avoiding also everything related to over-dependency and the risk that lies upon the shadow that lies upon our supply chains around the world. De-risking, as Ursula von der Leyen said very recently. And of course, the third point is after sovereignty and security, it's about solidarity. It's trying to avoid that any of the 27 member states try to find its own way and play its own national game, because we won't have the leverage if we do that. We need to work together to get the right political weight in order to sustain the offensive and the competition of other partners, and to be able from there on to move ahead. What is the way ahead? And I will end there, and I apologize for being too long. But I think it has a lot to do with the discussions you're going to have today here in Ifri. It's for me, first of all, looking for partners outside of the European Union, looking for partners which share the same concern, face the same challenges, and look for cooperation and partnership. In other words, where are our friends around the world and with whom can we work to face the competition of China, let's put it that way, and to face also the competition of the United States and the sort of unstable, uncertain policy that we're seeing today in the economic and the trade field stemming out of Washington. From there on, it's engaging with these partners on defining the right approach in trade, on new technology, industrial partnerships, so on and so forth, for the long term, and see how we can together build concrete projects that could be set up in common joint ventures and working together. There is a lot of experience, particularly in Asia, and I'm sure you will discuss a lot about this, about the future of critical minerals. As many experts will remind you, there are a lot of critical minerals in the OECD countries. It's just that they haven't looked at it in the past because there was enough foresight about the importance of the critical minerals. And for lack of planning and preparing this situation we're at today, we're facing this over-dependency, which is so difficult to handle together. And I think I would go one step further, if you allow me. It's also together with our new partners, our friends, as I was saying earlier, to revisit together trade policy and trade relations in order to try to come up with a vision of where trade would go, where multilateral trade would go at a time when it is being upended by some of the main trade partners around the world, namely the US and and China. Look at some of the principles that were the basis of WTO, and which have somewhat totally disappeared today in the deals that we have passed with each of us with the US administration. Non-discrimination, reciprocity. But for this, and in order to have our voice being heard, we need to be strong. As in the geopolitical world, where we're speaking more and more about peace through strength, which, by the way, goes back to Ronald Reagan, not a new concept. We need to use the same behavior and the same attitude with regard to the challenge in the trade sector, but more generally in the economic center. And therefore, we have to think together with these new partners, renewed partnership I'm talking about. We need to discuss with them about what could be our leverage, what should be our attitude in possible discussions and conversation with our most important trade partners. What are our assets? How to get rid of our over-dependency? How to play the game of escalation for de-escalation, and to know the ground we're going in when we're decided to go for trade measures to protect our market. So it seems to me that there is a completely new field of cooperation and partnership with those partners, and I think this is the issue of today. I, as a diplomat, only give you the frame of these discussion, the easy part of it. You have now to fulfill it during the day, but I wish you a great success in doing that, and I apologize for being too long, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pierre Vimont. I hesitate to give the floor to Marc Julien for the next panel or to ask you a question. I don't know if you have enough time and if we can take 5 minutes. Okay, so let's take 5 minutes. The question is the following. I mean, I have actually many questions, but you used this sentence. You said autonomy is about sovereignty, which is, of course, true. But the thing is that the EU today is still the addition of 27 sovereign countries, and there will be probably more to come. And we know that there are nationalist, populist forces that are on the rise in Europe. And for these forces, the concept of European strategic autonomy probably does not make sense, or perhaps it's evolving, will tell me. So the question is, do you think that strategic autonomy is still possible at the national level, or some kind of European strategic autonomy is necessary even for populist and nationalist forces?
To put it in a nutshell, first of all, I completely agree with your analysis. Your assessment is very good. And the point being made by many Eurosceptics, I would say, is how can you have a strategy when you are 27? I hear a lot of this even from some of our interlocutors outside of Europe. How can you have a common strategy on trade, on military defense, on other issues when you don't share the same vision of the world and the same opinion of how to move ahead in our foreign policy and our economic policy. And I think it's right. It's very difficult. But the other side of the picture is that, can we expect to be a force in international negotiation if each and every one of our member states tries to negotiate on its own? When you are facing competitors of the magnitude and the size of China on trade, or the US on new tech or on defense. We need to act collectively. What I was talking about earlier on, about solidarity being part, an element of that strategic autonomy. But then the question is, if the current institutional system doesn't work at 27, then let's look at how we can improve it. And I'm not thinking, let's be honest, about qualified majority voting, because not for one instance, I think this will go down easily with all 27 member states. I'm not even thinking about Hungary, by the way. I'm thinking about some of other member states who are still rather reluctant to let this instrument go away. My point is, if you want to have a more flexible Europe, you need to build up flexible coalitions, like the one we have seen in Ukraine recently. A fascinating experience where it was launched by EU member states, France, and a non-EU member states, now Britain, where we have most of the EU member states, but we have also third countries participating, Canada, Australia, and Japan as an observer for the time being. This is the kind of new initiative I think it's important to say. I always come back to what I witnessed at the time, which seemed very brave and audacious, but managed to be maybe one of the few diplomatic initiatives of the EU that came out successfully. It was the initiative by 3 foreign ministers from Europe, Germany, Britain, and France, to launch in 2003 what became the initiative on the Iranian nuclear program. We started 3. As the Iranian side accepted to go along, we brought in the High Representative at the time, Javier Solana, who was the bridge between the 3 member states and the other members of the EU. And we went ahead with this. All the more so, and I find this fascinating, that with the Brexit underway and Brexit being implemented, Britain has remained part of the trio that leads the Europeans on this initiative. Now, of course, the initiative and the GCPOA has fallen on difficult ground, and it's difficult to reinitiate the whole process, but maybe we will succeed. But the 3 are still there and still trying to work out some new process, if possible. And this was accepted by our other partners, because I thought that was the right way to proceed. Why not launch initiatives of the same kind, if necessary, in other fields? You will tell me, of course, that trade is a community competence. So we need the Commission on board. But I think they would be happy to try that with some of the more ambitious member states who are ready to go along. And think of it for 1 second, as I was telling earlier, the debate between the protectionists and the anti-protectionists that was all over the place in Europe in the 80s, the 90s, etc., is changing and morphing and shaping in a totally different way. When you have Germany and German manufacturers telling that we were a bit of ignorant of the reality of our trade policy with regard to China, and that we need to be much more adult today. When you think about the Netherlands, I was saying earlier, deciding to take control of Nexperia, the microchip firm, so on and so forth. So I think what is important to get out of this is that there is a change of mindset in Europe. We're not anymore the champions of soft power. We are starting to understand that we have to react, to push back, to fight. and to fight with the right leverage. And I think that not only do we need to do that collectively, but we need to find partners around the world to do that. And this is, if only the one lesson I would like to come out of this discussion is that message. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for sharing this lesson. I think the message is very clear and everyone understands it here in the room and online. Thank you very much again, Pierre Vimont, for your keynote speech. And let me yield the floor to Marc Julien for the first panel.